The school auditorium buzzed with chatter and laughter. Parents exchanged stories and children darted around, their excitement palpable. I stood near the back, my eyes fixed on Jennifer and Michael, who were standing together, chatting animatedly. My heart was heavy, but I forced myself to remain calm. The evening had arrived. My carefully orchestrated plan was about to unfold. Just weeks ago, our son, Thomas, had come home with a troubled look that no 6-year-old should wear. He hesitated before finally blurting out, "Dad, I saw Mom with Michael. They were hugging." The innocent revelation was like a punch to the gut. I had trusted Jennifer implicitly, and now, everything was unraveling before my eyes. I started to keep a close eye on Jennifer. The late nights, the mysterious phone calls, and the way she seemed to always have an excuse for not being at home. Each detail pointed to an affair. Michael, the dance instructor, had always been a friendly face in our lives, and now he was the center of our problems. The way Jennifer smiled at him, the way they touched, every gesture screamed betrayal. I knew that confronting Jennifer directly wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about me or our broken marriage, it was about public humiliation. Jennifer needed to face the consequences of her actions in front of everyone who mattered to her. That's when I decided to use the upcoming school event as the stage for my revenge. With meticulous planning, I helped Jennifer prepare for the event, never letting on that I knew the truth. I played the supportive husband, pretending to be excited about her performance and the chance to socialize. Behind the scenes, I was arranging a dramatic reveal. I had secured a spot for Thomas to speak at the event, under the guise of sharing his experiences and excitement about school. As the evening unfolded, I watched Jennifer's face light up when she saw her friends and colleagues. She was oblivious to the trap I had set. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and anticipation. The moment was close. When the time came, I could see Jennifer's pride as she cheered for Thomas, who had been prepped and rehearsed. Then, with a deep breath, Thomas stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat, his small frame barely reaching the stand. "I saw Mom with Michael," he said, his voice quivering but clear. They were hugging. The silence that followed was deafening. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I watched as Jennifer's face drained of color. She tried to move towards the stage, but the damage was already done. Michael's eyes darted around, realizing the full impact of the situation. The reaction from the parents was swift. Whispers turned into a cacophony of speculation. Friends who once stood by Jennifer's side now looked at her with pity or disdain. Michael's career, already shaky, was now all but over. The shock in the room was palpable. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the auditorium. By the end of the evening, the reality of the situation had fully set in. Michael was facing the end of his teaching career, and Jennifer was left with shattered friendships and a tarnished reputation. The scene had played out exactly as I had envisioned. As we drove home, I could see the weight of defeat in Jennifer's posture. I looked over at Thomas, who was quietly sitting in the back seat, and I knew that he had witnessed a painful lesson about the consequences of betrayal. I had orchestrated this moment to the letter, and now, with everything in motion, it was time to leave the wreckage behind. The public exposure was complete. Jennifer had lost her place in the community, and I had taken back control of my life. The evening had been both a painful and cathartic end to a chapter that had been filled with deceit and heartache. The morning after the event, the house felt eerily quiet. Jennifer hadn't said a word since we left the school, and I wasn't in the mood to force any conversation. The weight of last night's revelation hung over us like a storm cloud. But I wasn't ready to acknowledge it just yet. I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the sound of dishes clinking together, probably trying to act like everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, watching her from across the room. She didn't meet my gaze, her eyes glued to the counter as she made coffee. Her movements were robotic, as if she was just going through the motions, too afraid to confront the reality of what had happened. "Do you want to talk about it?" I finally broke the silence, though I already knew the answer. She flinched, her hands trembling as she poured the coffee. "What's there to talk about, Charles?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with bitterness and shame. "What's there to talk about?" I repeated, my voice growing sharper. "You've been cheating on me with our son's dance teacher, Jennifer. That's not exactly something we can just brush under the rug." Her face crumpled, but she didn't say anything, just stood there holding the coffee pot like it was a lifeline. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the image of her and Michael, smiling and laughing together like nothing was wrong, quickly extinguished any trace of sympathy. I didn't want it to happen this way, she muttered, finally setting the pot down and turning to face me. Her eyes were red, swollen from the tears she must have shed in private. Then how did you want it to happen, Jennifer? You were going to keep it a secret forever? I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor as I pushed it back. Or maybe you thought I'd never find out. She shook her head, tears spilling over her cheeks. I don't know what I thought, she said, her voice breaking. It just happened. It just happened? I repeated, incredulous. That's your excuse? You've destroyed everything, and all you have to say is, it just happened. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands as she leaned against the counter for support. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but I stayed where I was, my anger too fresh to allow for any compassion. You ruined us, Jennifer, I continued, my voice cold and controlled. And now you're going to face the consequences. Do you have any idea what people are saying about you? About us? She looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with despair. Charles, please, I didn't mean for any of this. But it doesn't matter, does it? You did it. And last night? That was only the beginning. Her eyes widened in horror. What do you mean? What more could you possibly do? I smiled, but it wasn't a kind one. Michael's been fired, I said calmly, relishing the fear that flickered across her face. His career is over. And as for you, well, I'm sure the gossip is spreading fast. Your friends won't want anything to do with you after this. You're toxic now, Jennifer. You're about to find out just how alone you really are. She stared at me, speechless, the full weight of her situation finally sinking in. I could see the realization in her eyes, she had lost everything. Her reputation, her friends, her marriage. It was all crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I turned away from her, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as I headed for the door. I'm taking Thomas out for the day, I said over my shoulder. You should take some time to think about what's next for you. Because as far as I'm concerned, there's no going back. The last thing I saw before I walked out the door was her crumpled figure, leaning against the counter, sobbing into her hands. But I didn't feel pity. I felt free. As I drove with Thomas in the backseat, the weight that had been crushing me for weeks began to lift. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own life. Jennifer had betrayed me, but I had reclaimed my power. She would have to live with the consequences of her actions, and I would make sure she felt the sting of her choices for a long time to come. Thomas was quiet, but I could tell he was processing everything. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. You okay, buddy? He nodded slowly. Yeah, Dad, I just don't understand, why would Mom do that? I sighed, trying to find the right words. Sometimes people make bad decisions, Thomas. It doesn't mean they don't love us, but it does mean they hurt us. And when they do, we have to decide how we deal with it. He looked out the window, thinking, are we gonna be okay? I smiled, this time a genuine one. Yeah, kid, we're gonna be okay. And as I drove away from the wreckage of my marriage, I knew that. For the first time in months, I believed it. The days after the school event were a blur of whispered conversations, sidelong glances, and polite avoidance. I knew it would come to this. Jennifer was now the town's favorite topic, her scandal providing endless fuel for gossip. Even as I dropped Thomas off at school, I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. But I wasn't the one they were whispering about. They were waiting for Jennifer to show up, to see how she'd handle the shame that had become her shadow. I took some satisfaction in that. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Michael's firing had been swift. I heard from a few parents that he was packing up and leaving town, a fallen figure in what had once been a prestigious dance program. I could only imagine how Jennifer felt about that. Every day, I waited for her to explode, to lash out at me, but all I got was silence. She hadn't slept in our bed since that night. Instead, she took the guest room. The door always closed, as if that thin piece of wood could protect her from the reality crashing down around her. Part of me wondered what she did in there all day. Did she think about how her actions had led to this? Did she regret it? I didn't care enough to ask. It was a Saturday morning when I finally saw her crack. I was in the kitchen, making breakfast for Thomas, when she walked in, her face pale and gaunt. She hadn't been eating properly, and it showed. She sat down at the table, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. Charles, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I didn't look at her right away. Instead, I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my tone flat, uninterested. She stared down into her cup as if searching for the right words. "I've lost everything," she whispered. "Michael's gone. My friends, they won't even return my calls. I went to the grocery store yesterday, and everyone looked at me like I was a stranger. Like I don't belong here anymore." I shrugged. "Maybe you don't." Her eyes shot up, wide with shock. She hadn't expected that. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "What did you think was going to happen, Jennifer? That people would just forgive and forget? You humiliated me. You humiliated yourself. And now you're paying the price." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, trying to hold herself together. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know. I lost control." I scoffed, shaking my head. "You didn't lose control, Jennifer. You made a choice. Over and over again, you chose Michael. And now you have to live with that choice." She was silent for a long moment, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hate me?" That question hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Did I hate her? I thought about it for a long time, staring into my coffee as I weighed my feelings. The truth was, I wasn't sure. I didn't feel the same way about her as I once did, that much was clear. But hate? No, I didn't have the energy for that. "I don't hate you," I said finally, my voice low. "But I don't love you either. Not anymore." Her face crumpled, and this time, the tears came. She didn't try to stop them, just sat there, sobbing into her hands. I watched her, unmoved. I had already cried my tears and felt my anger, and now all that was left was this empty acceptance. Our marriage was over, even if the papers hadn't been signed yet. "I want a divorce," I said, the words calm and clear. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. "Please, Charles," she begged. "Can't we try? Can't we fix this?" I shook my head. "It's too late for that." Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I stood up, leaving her there at the table. There was nothing more to say. The divorce process was surprisingly quick. There wasn't much to fight over. Jennifer didn't try to contest anything. I think she knew she didn't have the strength. Thomas stayed with me most of the time, though Jennifer tried to see him whenever she could. I didn't stop her. She was still his mother, after all, no matter how much she had destroyed between us. Word spread quickly in town about our split. It didn't take long for the invitations to dry up. And for Jennifer to become even more isolated. She had no one left, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. But that wasn't my problem anymore. One afternoon, as I was picking Thomas up from school, one of the parents, a woman named Karen, approached me. She offered me a sympathetic smile. "I heard about what happened," she said, her voice soft and kind. "I just wanted to say, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." I nodded, appreciating the gesture, though I wasn't sure what to say. People's pity didn't interest me. But as I watched Thomas run towards me, his face full of joy, I realized something. My life wasn't destroyed. Not like Jennifer's. I had my son. I had my integrity. And I had a chance to rebuild. As we drove home that evening, the sun setting behind us, I glanced over at Thomas, who was happily chattering away about his day at school. I smiled to myself, feeling a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed, and now, I was ready to move forward. Jennifer had made her choices. And she had paid the price. But me? I still had everything that mattered. And that was enough. After the divorce, life settled into a strange rhythm. The house felt quieter and emptier without Jennifer's presence. She had moved out shortly after the papers were signed, taking only a few things with her, mostly clothes and personal items. The furniture, the photos, and the pieces of our shared life remained. But those things no longer held the same meaning. Thomas and I adjusted. We spent more time together. And I tried to make his life as normal as possible, despite everything that had happened. He asked about his mother occasionally, and I did my best to keep my answers neutral. I didn't want to poison him against her. She had made her mistakes, but she was still his mother. He needed to come to his own conclusions about who she was. One day, while we were sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast, Thomas looked up at me, his face serious in a way that made him seem older than his years. "Dad, do you still love Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question caught me off guard. I stared at him for a moment, trying to decide how to answer. The truth was complicated, and I didn't want to burden him with the full weight of it. I care about her, I said carefully. She's always going to be your mom, and that's important. But sometimes, when people hurt each other, it's hard to feel the same way about them. Thomas seemed to think about that for a while, chewing his cereal in silence. Then he nodded as if he understood. I miss her, he admitted softly. I know, I said, reaching out to ruffle his hair. You'll still see her. We'll figure it out. And we did. Jennifer saw Thomas regularly, though our interactions were brief and civil at best. She was no longer the person I had loved, but we had to coexist for our son Sake. It was strange, this new normal, but I found that I didn't miss the old life. In fact, I was beginning to realize just how much had been wrong for a long time. About a month after the divorce, I ran into Michael in town. It was bound to happen eventually, though I hadn't expected it so soon. He was standing outside the local coffee shop, looking every bit as miserable as I imagined he'd be. His once confident posture was gone, replaced by a slumped, defeated look. He saw me before I had a chance to turn away, and I braced myself for whatever confrontation might come. Charles, he said, his voice low and strained. Can I talk to you? I stopped, though every instinct told me to keep walking. What do you want, Michael? He rubbed the back of his neck, looking down at the ground. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I stared at him, unsure of what to make of his apology. It felt hollow, like too little, too late. But I wasn't interested in dragging this out. I had moved on, and I didn't need his guilt weighing me down. Doesn't change anything, I said bluntly. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. Michael nodded, his face pale. I know. I lost my job, my reputation, everything. Stop, I cut him off, raising a hand. I don't care about your sob story, Michael. You knew what you were doing when you got involved with Jennifer. Now you're facing the consequences, just like she is. He looked like he wanted to say more, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there on the sidewalk, a broken man. I didn't feel sorry for him. He had earned every bit of his downfall. Just as Jennifer had. And now, they both had to live with the aftermath. As I walked back to my car, I felt a sense of closure. For the first time in months, the weight of the past felt lighter. Michael and Jennifer's choices had hurt me, but they hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, and that was enough. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. The divorce had left its mark, but it hadn't broken me. I threw myself into my work, spent more time with Thomas, and started reconnecting with old friends. Slowly but surely, the wounds from Jennifer's betrayal began to heal. One evening, after I'd put Thomas to bed, I sat down on the couch with a beer in hand, reflecting on everything that had happened. It was strange to think about how much had changed in such a short time. The man I had been before Jennifer's affair felt like a distant memory, but I wasn't sure that was a bad thing. I had learned a lot about myself in the process, about my own strength, about what I was willing to fight for. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I started dating again. It was awkward at first, navigating the world of relationships after so many years of marriage. But it felt good to be out there, meeting new people, rediscovering a part of myself that had been dormant for too long. One night, after a particularly pleasant date, I found myself thinking about Jennifer. Not in a longing way, but with a sense of curiosity. I wondered where she was, what she was doing, and whether she had found some semblance of peace in the mess she had created. I didn't reach out to her. We had agreed to keep our communication limited to matters involving Thomas, and I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds. But I couldn't help but wonder if she had learned anything from all of this. If she had come to understand the depth of the pain she had caused, not just to me, but to herself and to our son. A few months later, Jennifer and I attended Thomas's school play together. It was the first time we'd been in the same room for more than a few minutes since the divorce. As I sat in the auditorium, watching Thomas perform, I couldn't help but glance over at her. She looked tired, thinner than before, as if the weight of everything had finally taken its toll. But there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, a resilience that surprised me. When the play ended, Thomas ran over to us, his face lit up with excitement. "Did you see me, Dad? Did you see, Mom?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "You were great, buddy. We're proud of you." Jennifer nodded, a soft smile on her face. You were amazing, Thomas. For a brief moment, it almost felt like old times. But then reality set back in, and the distance between us became clear once more. As we left the school that night, Jennifer caught my arm, stopping me in the parking lot. Charles, she said quietly, her eyes filled with regret. I just wanted to say, thank you. For not shutting me out of Thomas's life. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful. I looked at her, the woman who had once been my everything. Now just a shadow of that person. He needs his mom, I said simply. No matter what happened between us, that doesn't change. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'll never forgive myself for what I did, she whispered. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. We both knew that forgiveness wasn't something she would easily find, neither from me nor from herself. As I drove home with Thomas, I realized that this was the true end. Not the moment I had filed for divorce. Not the public humiliation or the signed papers. This was it. The final chapter in a story that had once held so much promise, but had ended in ashes. And yet, in the midst of all that destruction, there was hope. For me, for Thomas, and maybe, in time, even for Jennifer. We were moving forward, and that was all that mattered now. The fallout from the school event lingered for weeks. Michael's firing was immediate, and Jennifer's social standing crumbled just as quickly. Word spread through the community like wildfire. And before long, everyone knew about the affair. Parents at the school, old friends, and even neighbors we barely knew all seemed to have an opinion about what had happened. Jennifer tried to keep her head up at first, but the pressure of being shunned by nearly everyone around her was too much. I heard through Thomas that she had stopped going to her favorite coffee shop, the one where she used to meet her friends. They had all distanced themselves, leaving her alone in the wake of her choices. One afternoon, when I went to drop Thomas off at her apartment for the weekend, I saw it on her face. The weight of her decisions had settled on her shoulders like a heavy burden, one she clearly wasn't prepared to carry. She opened the door, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was no anger in her expression anymore, no defiance. Just quiet resignation. How's he been? She asked, gesturing toward Thomas, who had already bolted past her and into his room. He's fine, I said, keeping my tone neutral. But he's still asking questions about everything. Jennifer nodded, a flicker of pain crossing her face. I know. I'm trying to be there for him, but it's hard. I leaned against the doorframe, taking in the sight of the woman who had once been the center of my life. You made it hard, I said, not unkindly, but firmly. She looked down at her feet, avoiding my gaze. I know, she whispered. I'm paying for it now. It was true. She was paying the price, socially, emotionally, and financially. Michael had vanished from town, likely running from the shame, leaving Jennifer to pick up whatever pieces of her life she could. But there was no sympathy left in me for her. Not anymore. I had moved on from feeling sorry for her, and I wasn't going to start now. I have to go, I said, stepping back. Thomas will be ready on Sunday night. I'll pick him up then. She nodded but didn't say anything as I turned and walked away. The door closed softly behind me, and as I drove off, I realized just how far we had both fallen from the life we had once shared. Time passed, and the shockwaves from the school event finally began to subside. People moved on, as they always do, finding new scandals and dramas to fill the void. But for Jennifer and me, the damage was already done. Our lives had changed irrevocably, and there was no going back. For me, that was a good thing. I had learned to enjoy the quiet moments with Thomas, the simple joys of spending time with him without the shadow of a failing marriage looming over us. We spent weekends going to baseball games, hiking, and building model airplanes, things that had once seemed like distractions, but now felt like the foundation of our new life together. Jennifer, on the other hand, struggled. She lost her job at the dance studio shortly after the affair became public knowledge, and though she tried to find work elsewhere, no one in town was willing to hire her. She was left with few options, forced to make decisions that would have been unthinkable a year ago. One evening, Thomas asked me a question I hadn't expected. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, when he turned to me with a serious expression. Dad, do you think Mom's ever going to be okay again? I took a deep breath, unsure of how to answer. It was a question that had been on my mind for months, and I still didn't know the answer. Jennifer's life had fallen apart, and while part of me believed that she deserved it, another part of me, perhaps the part that had once loved her, felt a pang of sadness for her. I don't know, buddy, I said honestly. But people can change. Sometimes, it just takes a lot of time. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, looking down at his hands. I miss how things used to be. I know, I said quietly, reaching out to rest a hand on his shoulder. But things are different now. And that's okay. We'll figure it out together. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected call from Jennifer. She had been quiet for a while, keeping her distance outside of the necessary interactions regarding Thomas. But this call felt different, urgent, somehow. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice strained. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to get involved in whatever crisis she was dealing with. But something in her tone made me agree. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, one that wasn't frequented by anyone we knew. Jennifer looked exhausted when she walked in, her once vibrant energy replaced by a dull weariness. She sat down across from me, folding her hands tightly in her lap. I've decided to leave town, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't surprised. After everything that had happened, it made sense. There was nothing left for her here, and she needed a fresh start somewhere far from the wreckage of her past. I think that's for the best, I said slowly. What about Thomas? She sighed, her eyes filling with tears. I'll visit him, of course. But he's better off staying with you. He needs stability, and I can't give him that right now. It was the first time she had admitted it, the first time she had acknowledged that she had lost her way. There was no fight left in her, no more excuses. Just acceptance. I'll take care of him, I said softly. You don't have to worry about that. She nodded, wiping away a stray tear. I know. You've always been a good father, Charles. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the past between us. Then, Jennifer stood up, pulling her coat tightly around her shoulders. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. For everything. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As she turned and walked out of the cafe, I realized that this was truly the end. Not just of our marriage, but of the chapter that had defined our lives for so long. And as I watched her disappear into the distance, I felt a strange sense of relief. The storm had passed, and now, all that was left was to rebuild, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. The weeks after Jennifer left town were strangely quiet. Thomas adjusted more quickly than I had expected. He was resilient, more than I had given him credit for. We established a routine: school, baseball practice, dinners at home. Life, for the first time in years, felt normal. It was as if the chaos that had once surrounded us had lifted, leaving behind a piece I hadn't realized I was missing. At night, when Thomas was asleep, I often found myself thinking about Jennifer. Not in the way I used to, with anger or frustration, but with a sense of closure. She had made her choices, and so had I. The bitterness that had once fueled me was fading, replaced by a desire to simply move forward. One evening, as I was sorting through some old papers, I found a photograph of us, Jennifer, Thomas, and me, at a beach from years ago. We looked happy, carefree, untouched by the complexities that would later define our lives. I stared at it for a long time before placing it in a box with other memories, closing the lid, and putting it away. The future was what mattered now. And I wasn't going to let the past hold me back anymore. Months passed, and the dust from the scandal had fully settled. People stopped whispering when I walked by, and the stares that once followed me through town were gone. Jennifer hadn't reached out since she left, aside from a few texts checking in on Thomas. I hadn't asked where she'd gone, and she hadn't volunteered the information. That chapter of our lives was over, and it was best left that way. On Saturday, Thomas and I were at the park, tossing a baseball back and forth. He had improved so much since we started practicing, and I couldn't help but feel proud of how he'd grown, both as a player and as a person. The weight of everything that had happened didn't seem to burden him anymore, and in a way, that gave me a sense of relief. As we played, I noticed a woman sitting on a bench nearby, watching us. She had a book in her lap but seemed more interested in the game. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a passerby enjoying the day. But after a while, she stood up and approached us with a smile. Your son's got a great arm, she said, nodding toward Thomas, who was winding up for another throw. I smiled. Yeah, he's been working hard. It's his favorite sport. She extended her hand. I'm Allison. Charles, I said, shaking her hand. For a moment, we stood there awkwardly, the way strangers do when they're trying to figure out what comes next. But there was something about her presence that felt easy. Comfortable. Even. Do you guys come here often? She asked. Pretty much every weekend, I replied. It's kind of our thing. She nodded, glancing at Thomas again. I'm a teacher over at the elementary school. I thought I recognized him. That explained it. She seemed familiar in that small town kind of way, where everyone's connected somehow. We chatted for a bit longer before she wished us well and walked back to her bench. As I watched her leave, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of possibility. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was the sense that life was opening up again, that there were new beginnings waiting just around the corner. When Thomas and I got home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about Allison. The encounter had been brief, but it left me wondering. Maybe it was time to let someone else into our lives, even if just as a friend. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but I also knew I couldn't let the past define my future. Later that night, as Thomas got ready for bed, he asked me something that took me by surprise. Dad, do you think you'll ever get married again? I froze, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't something I had considered. Marriage felt like a distant, foreign concept now, after everything that had happened. I don't know, buddy, I said honestly. Maybe someday. But right now, I'm just focused on us. He seemed to accept that answer, nodding thoughtfully before climbing into bed. As I tucked him in, I realized how much he had grown, not just physically, but emotionally. He had been through a lot, but he had come out of it stronger, and I couldn't have been prouder of him. As I turned off the light and closed his door, I realized something else. Maybe I had grown, too. Maybe I was ready to leave the pain behind and embrace whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so daunting. It seemed full of promise. And as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I allowed myself to hope. Just a little, that better days were ahead. A few more weeks passed, and life continued its steady pace. Thomas seemed to thrive in this new normal, and I began to feel more grounded than I had in years. The park became our weekend tradition, and each time we went, I hoped to see Allison again, though I wasn't quite sure why. Something about her had stuck with me, her warmth, her understanding, her quiet presence. One Saturday, as we packed up to leave the park, there she was again, sitting on the same bench. This time, when our eyes met, she waved and walked over before I could even consider an excuse to talk to her. Back again? She asked, smiling at Thomas as he ran ahead. Yeah, can't keep this kid away from the field, I replied, grinning. I get it. Some kids just have that passion, she said. Mind if I join you for a few throws? I was a bit taken aback by her offer, but Thomas immediately perked up at the suggestion. Sure, he said before I could respond. Allison took off her jacket and grabbed the ball from Thomas. Her movements natural and unforced. She threw it with surprising accuracy, and Thomas beamed with excitement, instantly warming to her. As the three of us passed the ball back and forth, I couldn't help but feel a sense of ease settle over me. It wasn't complicated or heavy, just a simple, shared moment that felt right. After a while, Allison and I sat on the sidelines while Thomas kept practicing his throws against a tree. Thanks for letting me join in, she said, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. It's nice to be out here. No problem, I replied, genuinely meaning it. Thomas seems to really like you. She chuckled. I've always had a soft spot for kids like him. Independent, but still looking for that connection. There was something in the way she said it that made me pause. It felt personal, like she understood something deeper about our situation without even knowing the details. I wondered if she had her own story, something she had gone through that left her with that same quiet resilience I saw in myself. We chatted for a while longer, exchanging stories about work and life in the town. She told me about her students, the challenges of teaching, and how much she loved being part of their lives. I shared a bit about my job, how I had been juggling everything since the divorce, and how Thomas had been my anchor through it all. Before long, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field. Thomas ran up to us, panting but smiling wide. Dad, can we come back tomorrow? I glanced at Allison, who gave me a small smile. I think we can make that happen, I said. As we packed up and headed to the car, I realized that something had shifted. Allison wasn't just someone we saw at the park anymore. She was becoming a part of our routine, someone I looked forward to seeing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could trust someone outside of our small circle again. The next day, Thomas and I returned to the park, and as if it were meant to be, Allison was there again. This time, she brought a frisbee, and we spent the afternoon laughing, running, and tossing it back and forth across the field. It felt effortless, like we were all a team, each of us playing our part in this new dynamic. Afterward, as we sat on the grass catching our breath, Thomas looked up at me and said, "Allison's really fun, Dad." I glanced over at her, and she smiled softly. "She is, isn't she?" Thomas nodded, then turned to Allison. "Do you think you could teach me some tricks with the frisbee next time?" Of course, she replied, ruffling his hair. "I'll come prepared with some new moves." As we sat there, I couldn't help but feel a growing connection between us. It wasn't just about the games or the shared moments. It was about the way Allison fit into our lives so naturally, the way she seemed to understand without needing an explanation. Later that evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, I found myself thinking about Allison again. The way she interacted with Thomas, the ease with which she blended into our routine. It felt like a missing piece had fallen into place. A friendly golden retriever named Max, who immediately won Thomas over. The three of us spent the afternoon throwing sticks for Max, laughing as he bounded after them with unbridled enthusiasm. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the park, I realized how much things had changed in such a short time. Allison had become a regular part of our weekends, and each time we saw her, it felt less like a chance encounter and more like something that was meant to be. At one point, Thomas turned to me and asked, "Do you think Allison could come over for dinner sometime?" His question caught me off guard, but before I could respond, Allison smiled and said, "I'd love to, if that's okay with your dad." I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. But then I saw the look in Thomas's eyes, hopeful, excited, and I knew what the answer had to be. "That sounds like a great idea," I said, smiling at both of them. "How about next weekend?" Thomas grinned, and Allison nodded, her eyes meeting mine with a look of understanding. There was no pressure, no rush. Just a sense that this was the right next step. As we packed up and headed home, I felt a sense of contentment settle over me. Things were changing, yes, but for the first time in a long time, that change felt like a new beginning rather than an end. The week passed quickly, filled with work and the usual routine. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the upcoming dinner with Allison. It was a simple invitation. But to me, it felt significant, another step forward, another chance to rebuild something that had been shattered long ago. Thomas was excited about the dinner, chattering non-stop about it every evening. He asked what we would cook, how we'd set the table, and whether we should rent a movie for after. His enthusiasm was contagious, and before I knew it, I was looking forward to it just as much as he was. Saturday evening arrived, and we were busy in the kitchen preparing spaghetti, Thomas's favorite. The smell of tomato sauce and garlic filled the house as we worked side by side, laughing and joking like it was any other day. But there was an air of anticipation, too, a sense that this wasn't just another night. When the doorbell rang, Thomas practically sprinted to answer it. "Allison's here," he shouted excitedly as he flung open the door. There she stood, smiling warmly with a bottle of wine in one hand and a small bouquet of flowers in the other. "Thought I'd bring a little something," she said, holding out the flowers to Thomas, who took them with wide eyes. "Thanks," he beamed, turning to me. "Dad, where should we put these?" I smiled, taking the flowers from him. "I'll find a vase." As I arranged the flowers on the dining table, I couldn't help but feel a little nervous. It wasn't like this was a date, but there was a weight to the evening that I couldn't ignore. Allison had become a part of our lives in a way I hadn't expected, and tonight felt like a defining moment. Whether or not this was going to become something more. We sat down to dinner, and the conversation flowed easily. Allison talked about her week at school, sharing funny stories about her students, while Thomas regaled her with tales of his baseball games and his latest frisbee tricks. I found myself sitting back, watching them interact, feeling a strange sense of contentment wash over me. It was the first time in a long time that our house had felt this alive. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where Thomas had already set up a movie for us to watch. He snuggled up between Allison and me on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen as the opening credits rolled. I glanced over at Allison, who met my gaze with a soft smile, and in that moment, I realized how much I had missed this sense of companionship, of being with someone who understood, who fit. As the movie played on, I let myself relax, enjoying the simple pleasure of the evening. There was no pressure, no expectations, Just the three of us, sitting together, enjoying each other's company. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was going to be okay. After that dinner, things between Allison and me seemed to shift naturally. We started seeing each other more often, not just at the park, but for dinners, walks, and even the occasional lunch on workdays. It was still casual, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that we were slowly becoming more than just friends. One evening, after dropping Thomas off at a friend's house for a sleepover, I invited Allison over for dinner again. It felt different this time, more intimate, with no kids around, just the two of us. As we cooked together, laughing and sharing stories, I couldn't help but feel like we were finally addressing the elephant in the room, the growing connection between us. After dinner, we sat on the porch, the warm night air wrapping around us like a blanket. I could feel the weight of the moment settling in, the quiet anticipation of what was about to come. "Allison," I began, my voice steady but cautious. "I just want to thank you for everything. You've been such a positive presence in Thomas's life, and in mine, too. I didn't expect any of this. And honestly, I didn't think I'd ever trust someone again, not after everything that happened with Jennifer." Allison turned to face me, her expression gentle and understanding. "I'm glad I could be there for both of you. I wasn't sure what to expect when we first started talking, but it's been really nice getting to know you and Thomas. You're both wonderful." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "I feel the same way. But I also know that I've got a lot of baggage, and I don't want to drag you into anything complicated. I don't want to make the same mistakes I made before." Allison reached over, placing her hand on mine. "Charles, I understand. We've both been through a lot. But I'm not asking for anything complicated. I'm just here, taking it one step at a time, and if that's enough for you, then it's enough for me." Her words were simple, but they hit me hard. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of my past, afraid to let anyone in, afraid to make the same mistakes again. But here was Allison, offering something different, something honest and real, without the pressure of expectations. I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. One step at a time sounds perfect. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, the soft chirping of crickets filling the air around us. It felt right, being there with her, not as some grand gesture or declaration, but as two people finding comfort in each other's presence. Before she left that night, Allison leaned in and kissed me softly on the cheek. "Good night, Charles," she whispered, her voice soft and full of warmth. "Good night, Allison," I replied, watching as she walked down the porch steps and into the night. As I closed the door behind her, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. The past was finally behind me, and for once, I was ready to embrace whatever the future had in store. The evening of the school event arrived faster than I anticipated. The gymnasium was buzzing with activity, parents, teachers, and students filled the space, excited for the performances and presentations that were about to take place. Thomas was running around with his friends, barely containing his excitement. To anyone else, it was just another wholesome night in a tight-knit community. But for me, it was something entirely different. I had spent weeks planning this. Every detail had been carefully thought out, from the timing to the audience I'd make sure was present. This was going to be the moment. The moment when everything came to a head, where Jennifer's betrayal would be laid bare for everyone to see. Jennifer had no idea what was coming. I watched her from across the room, laughing and talking with other parents, her smile wide and her guard down. She had moved on, or at least that's what it looked like. She acted like the perfect mother, the supportive wife, the attentive neighbor. But I knew better. I knew about the secret meetings with Michael. I knew about the late-night calls, the whispered conversations, and soon, so would everyone else. The principal began the program, introducing the first set of student performances. Thomas's class would be going on in about 30 minutes, and by then, everything would be in motion. I had coordinated with the AV team at the school under the guise of helping out with the event, and now, all I had to do was wait for my cue. The performances started off smoothly, kids dancing, singing, and giving their all as proud parents applauded from their seats. But I could barely focus on what was happening on stage. My heart was racing, not out of guilt or fear, but out of anticipation. This was it. This was my moment. Then, the time came. Just as the final applause for the last performance echoed through the gym, the lights dimmed slightly, and the screen behind the stage flickered to life. Parents turned their attention to the screen, expecting to see the typical slideshow of class photos, funny moments from the year, or teacher tributes. But what appeared wasn't a slideshow. It was footage. The footage I had been sitting on for weeks. The grainy video showed Jennifer and Michael standing outside the school, talking in hushed tones. The angle was shaky, captured by a camera I had strategically placed in our son's backpack, but it was clear enough. They were close, too close, and then, just as the audience watched in stunned silence, the two of them leaned in and kissed. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jennifer, who had been seated a few rows away from me, shot up from her seat, her face pale. I could see the panic in her eyes, the way she looked around, desperately trying to figure out what was happening. But it was too late. Whispers spread like wildfire through the gym. Parents who had once greeted her with friendly smiles now stared in shock, their faces a mixture of disbelief and judgment. I watched as Jennifer rushed to the front of the gym, trying to get to the stage, trying to stop what was happening. But she was too late. The damage had been done. Michael, who had been sitting at the back, froze in place. He didn't move, didn't try to intervene. He just sat there, staring at the screen as if his entire world had just been ripped apart. Because, in a way, it had. The school board members, who were seated near him, were already murmuring amongst themselves, shaking their heads in disapproval. I stood there, watching it all unfold, a strange sense of satisfaction washing over me. This was what they deserved. They had thought they could get away with it, that their affair would stay hidden, that I would never find out. But now, everyone knew. There was no hiding, no going back. As the video ended, the screen went black, and the room was left in stunned silence. Jennifer, now standing near the stage, looked at me with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I could see the realization dawning on her. This was my doing. She rushed toward me, her voice a frantic whisper. "Charles, what the hell have you done?" I didn't flinch. I did what needed to be done. I made sure everyone knows the truth. Her face crumpled, the weight of the public humiliation hitting her full force. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "We could have talked about it, worked something out." I shook my head slowly, my expression hard. "You made your choice, Jennifer. Now, you have to live with the consequences." She stood there, silent, as the whispers continued around us, parents looking at her with disdain, some even pulling their kids away as if being near her would somehow taint them. Michael, realizing the severity of the situation, finally stood up, but it was too late for him, too. I could see the panic in his eyes, the way he quickly grabbed his jacket and bolted for the exit. But the damage was done for him, too. The parents would talk, the school board would investigate, and soon enough, he'd be out of a job. As I watched him leave, a strange sense of calm settled over me. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about closure. I had done what I set out to do. Jennifer and Michael's secret was no longer hidden, and now they would face the fallout together. The aftermath of the school event was swift and brutal. News spread through the town like wildfire. It didn't take long for the gossip to reach every corner of our community. Jennifer's affair was the main topic at every dinner table, in every PTA meeting, and on every social media feed. By the time the weekend rolled around, she had become the talk of the town, and not in a good way. Jennifer tried to keep her head down, but it was impossible to avoid the whispers. Every time she stepped out of the house, eyes would follow her, judging, condemning. Friends who once stood by her side now avoided her, pretending not to see her at the grocery store or quickly changing the subject when her name came up. The mothers she once mingled with during school events turned cold. She had been ousted from their circle. I watched it all unfold with a sense of detachment. Part of me felt vindicated. This was what she deserved. She had broken my trust and destroyed our family, and now she was paying the price. But there was another part of me that felt something different, something unexpected, emptiness. I had gotten my revenge, but it hadn't fixed anything. The damage to our relationship, to our family, was too deep. Michael didn't fare much better. The school launched an internal investigation almost immediately. There were rules against teachers having relationships with parents, especially when it involved one of their own students. Within a week, Michael was gone. Fired. His name was erased from the school's website, and he disappeared from the town without a word. Thomas didn't understand at first. He was too young to fully grasp the situation, but he knew something was wrong. Kids at school had started whispering about his mom, and he came home one day, asking me why people were saying mean things. It broke my heart to see him confused and hurt by something he didn't even understand. Jennifer, for her part, tried to salvage what was left of her life. She apologized, again and again, but the words felt hollow now. The damage was irreversible. We barely spoke except when necessary, and even then, it was strained, every word laced with tension and regret. She spent most of her time in the house, avoiding people, trying to shield herself from the storm she had caused. I didn't leave immediately. I thought about it, but there was Thomas to consider. I wasn't about to abandon him just because his mother had. But I knew, deep down, that our marriage was over. There was no going back to the way things were, no matter how much she apologized or how many times she promised to change. One evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, Jennifer approached me in the living room. She looked exhausted, her face pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept well in weeks, and it showed. "Charles," she said quietly, sitting down across from me, "I know I've lost you. And I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for." I didn't respond at first. I just stared at her, waiting for her to say whatever she had come to say. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she continued. "But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did to you, to us, to our family." The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. "I never wanted things to end this way," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was stupid, and I ruined everything." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "It's too late, Jennifer." "I know," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know what to do anymore." There was a time when seeing her cry would have moved me and would have made me want to comfort her. But that time had passed. I had nothing left to give. "I think you should leave," I said finally, my voice cold and steady. She looked up at me, her eyes widening in shock. "What?" "I think it's best if you move out," I repeated. "You can stay with your parents or find somewhere else, but I think it's better for everyone if you're not here." She didn't argue. She didn't try to fight it. She just nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks as she realized that this was it. The end. That night, she packed a bag and left. I watched from the window as she drove away, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. The house felt different without her, quieter, emptier, but in a way, it was also peaceful. The constant tension was gone, replaced by a hollow silence. The next few weeks were hard. I had to explain to Thomas why his mom wasn't coming back, and why things were different now. He cried, of course, asking me why we couldn't all just be together again, why everything had to change. I didn't have the answers he wanted, but I tried my best to reassure him that we'd be okay. And we were. In time, things got easier. The whispers around town died down. People found something new to gossip about, and life moved on. Jennifer stayed with her parents for a while before eventually finding a place of her own. We shared custody of Thomas, and while things were never the same between us, we kept things civil for his sake. As for me, I found a strange sense of peace in the aftermath of everything. The anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge, it all faded in time. I had been through hell and back, but I had come out the other side. Stronger, wiser, and ready to move forward. Revenge had given me closure, but it hadn't brought me happiness. That, I realized, was something I had to find on my own. And in the quiet moments when the house was still, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay again.